Well, welcome to tonight's presentation, hosted by the Washington, D.C. chapter of the American Scientific Affiliation. My name is Mike Beidler. I'm the president of the D.C. chapter and an ASA fellow. I'm a retired naval officer, and I currently serve as a senior analyst for the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering's Joint Capability Technology Demonstration Program. It's a lot of words to describe what I do. Essentially, I just manage a portfolio of rapid prototyping projects using mature technologies to create innovative solutions for current and future problems that U.S. and allied militaries face. With me is DC Chapter Cy Gart, DC Chapter Vice President Cy Gart. Wave your hand there, Cy. He is also an ASA Fellow, and I will give him a chance to introduce himself briefly. Cy?
Hello, welcome. I'll just say for ASA, what I mostly do is I'm the editor-in-chief of God and Nature, the quarterly online magazine, and the co-editor with me is my wife, Haniko, who's also on this chat, on this meeting. And as I usually do with these meetings, I encourage everyone to join ASA if they're not yet a member, and also send articles, essays, poetry, whatever you like, to the magazine. Just find it at godandnature.asa3.org. That's it.
And we're pleased to have, as our panelists tonight, 9 of the 11 editors and authors of Kregel Publications' book, The Grand Canyon, Monument to an Ancient Earth, Can Noah's Flood Explain the Grand Canyon? Now, dubbed the Canyon's 11, our 9 panelists tonight include editor Gregg Davidson, a professor of geology and geological engineering at the University of Mississippi. We have contributor Joel Duff, professor of biology at the University of Akron, Ohio. Editor Tim Helble, the National Weather Service, retired. The editor Carol Hill, she's an adjunct professor at the University of New Mexico. We have contributor Stephen Moshier, professor and chair of the Geology and Environmental Science Department at Wheaton College, Illinois. We have editor Wayne Ranney. He's got a BS and an MS in Geology from Northern Arizona University, and he's also a Grand Canyon trail guide. And contributor Ralph Stearley. He's a professor emeritus at Calvin University. Contributor Roger Weens. He's a planetary scientist at Los Alamos Laboratory. And contributor Ken Wolgemuth. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Tulsa. Now, unfortunately, the contributors David Elliott from Northern Arizona University, professor of geology, and Brian Tapp, he's the chairman of the Geosciences Department at the University of Tulsa, can't be with us here this evening. So we've got 9 of the 11 contributors. And I think this is, if I'm not mistaken, the first time you all have gotten together as a group since the publication of the book 5 years ago. And a lot of this is due to the hard work of Ken, and I want to thank him right now for his assistance in soliciting our panelists' participation in tonight's event. And we couldn't have accomplished this without him. So we're thankful that you're choosing to be with us over binging Ted Lasso on Apple Plus, and glad you're joining us for this conversation. We also hope that everyone out there is faring well amidst this extended health crisis that's affecting the world, and that has kept us from meeting physically for nearly 2 years. And we pray that you're finding creative ways to stay connected and build community, as well as supporting the most vulnerable among us. Now, I just want to give a brief introduction to the American Scientific Affiliation, because I know that there are a lot of folks joining us tonight who are not ASA members. And as I go through this, if you're interested in joining the organization, we'd love for you to do so. So we're just going to get started here. Now, what is the ASA? We're an international network of Christians in the sciences. We were founded in 1941, and this year we're celebrating our 80th anniversary. And as scientists, we take part in humanity's exploration of nature and its laws. And the flip side of our coin is that we're Christians. We want to know not just how the universe came into being and operates, but why it exists in the first place. And so, taking those two halves together, we as members of the ASA believe that God is both the creator of our universe and the source of our ability to pursue knowledge. And that by openly and honestly studying both scripture and nature, that mutual benefit helps us develop a fuller understanding of our identity as human beings made in God's image and our environment. Now, we believe and accept the divine inspiration, trustworthiness, and authority of Scripture in matters of both faith and conduct. We confess in the triune God, as affirmed in the Nicene and Apostles' Creeds, and we believe that God, in creating and preserving the universe, has endowed it with order and intelligibility. And those two things are the basis for scientific investigation. And as Christians, we believe that we have a responsibility as stewards of God's creation to use our knowledge for the good of humanity and the entire created order. Now, we engage in this intersection of faith and science dialogue, and we use three primary platforms. First platform is discovery, ideas, and scholarship. The people on this panel tonight are preeminent in their fields, and we thank them for all of the dedicated hard work that they put throughout their careers into this book that we're going to talk about tonight. The second platform is professional development, helping people in their careers and their calling. And the third, we're doing this tonight, is fellowship and networking. We have about 4,000 members worldwide in a variety of fields, including theology and philosophy. We have 36 chapters across the United States and Canada, 25 in the US, including 5 student-run chapters and 11 in Canada. And we have a sister organization, the Canadian Scientific and Christian Affiliation. And I think some of them are going to be with us tonight. The frequency and location of our meetings are chapter dependent, anywhere from quarterly to bi-monthly to just twice a year to annually. And here in the DC area, we typically meet quarterly, and pre-COVID, we met 3 times a year plus a fall potluck social. But our physical meetings were held at National Presbyterian Church, and hopefully next year we'll be able to meet physically again. Some of the things that the ASA produces is perspectives on science and Christian faith. This is a quarterly publication, both in print and electronic. And this is our most recent issue, the September 2021 issue. And I do want to highlight that some of our panelists here tonight, Carol, you were one of them, wrote one of these articles, Original Sin with Respect to Science, Origins, Historicity of Genesis, and Traditional Church Views. And there were some responses to that article in this particular issue. One of our other projects is God and Nature magazine. This is a purely online publication. And Sai, if you want to introduce this particular publication and give it a little push.
Well, I think I already mentioned it, Mike. So,
Okay.
in the interest of time, I think that'll be enough.
All right, great. And we also have an annual meeting, and next year's annual meeting is going to take place at Point Loma Nazarene University in San Diego, God willing. And these annual meetings feature plenary talks, breakout sessions, field trips, a lot of opportunity for networking, some social events, and poster sessions. Down there is the nominal cost. That will vary from year to year. But as soon as that announcement comes out, if you get in early, you'll be able to save a considerable amount of money on that registration. So we hope to see you next year at Point Loma Nazarene University. Just real quick, if you're interested in becoming a member tonight and you've got a bachelor's degree in science at the very least, and again, science in the ASA is interpreted broadly, and can give assent to our statement of faith, you can become a full member. If you're a non-scientist, you can become associate member. And students, we encourage students to join us. And that particular membership is free. And tonight, we're going to offer a complimentary one-year membership. And we're going to put the code to get tonight's membership into the chat box. And I think I can do that real quick here. There we go. And if you take advantage of that tonight, we'll give you a complimentary one-year membership. Now, that was my brief introduction of the ASA. And we really want to spend the majority of this evening in this panel discussion. Now, before we get started with our panel discussion, I want to open up in a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for creating a universe that is orderly and intelligible, and giving us as human beings made in your image the ability to see and investigate and explore that order and intelligibility. Thank you for giving us the gift of science. Thank you for giving us the gift of your written word. We thank you for giving us your living word, Jesus Christ. And we thank you for the church that he founded. We thank you tonight for these 9 panelists. We thank you also for the ASA staff for their diligent hard work in helping us put all of this together. We just ask that you give us a great time of learning and fellowship this evening. In Jesus' name we pray. So I'm going to really quick introduce our panelists. I'm just going to read a few short bios, and then we'll begin the panel discussion. And just going down in alphabetical order here. Gregg Davidson, if you would raise your hand, give us a wave. Gregg is an ASA fellow. He's been a professor of geology and geological engineering at the University of Mississippi for the last 25 years. He's the author of multiple books on science and Christian faith, including The Manifold Beauty of Genesis 1, which just came out yesterday. So Gregg, congratulations. Joel Duff, give us a wave. Joel, give us a wave. He's a professor of biology at the University of Akron. He earned his BS in biology from Calvin College, now Calvin University, and a PhD in botany from the University of Tennessee. His research focuses on understanding biological diversity by examining differences in DNA sequences and genome structure. He's worked on numerous plant and animal systems and has authored more than 50 research articles in science journals. He's an active writer and speaker exploring the intersection of science and Christian faith, and obviously a contributor to the Grand Canyon book, and he blogs at Naturalis Historia. That's thenaturalhistorian.com. He's an avid nature photographer and enjoys exploring God's creation with his wife and 5 children. Tim Helble, go ahead and give us a wave. He's a retired hydrologist who worked most of his career at the National Weather Service, also some time in the National Park Service, and a map company in Los Angeles. He has an MS in watershed management from the University of Arizona with a specialization in watershed hydrology. He can only claim to be a science communicator rather than a true scientist like both of the other authors of the Grand Canyon, but I think he's being a little bit humble. He's had a variety of roles in the book, including compiling the list of flood geology claims about the Grand Canyon that needed to be addressed, and which this book does beautifully. He also wrote a few chapters, edited some others, and ensured that the most popular flood geology claims were addressed. And he also served as the photography editor and contributed several photos to the book and developed most of the book's graphics. Great work, beautiful book, Tim. Okay, Carol, you're an ASA fellow as well and author of many articles in our quarterly journal, Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. Carol has worked as a geologist in Carlsbad Cavern and other caves in the Guadalupe Mountains for 25 years, and then in the Grand Canyon for the last 20 years. She's published the apologetics books, The Grand Canyon, that we're discussing tonight, as well as A Worldview Approach to Science and Scripture. That's the Grand Canyon book. I got the other one on the shelf there. So, but anyway, she's been featured on Nova and National Geographic TV. And Carol currently teaches geology and climate science at the University of New Mexico. Stephen, thank you very much for showing the book, the right book. Excellent.
Thanks, Steve.
Speaking of Steve, who showed us the book, also an ASA fellow, professor of geology and chair of the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at Wheaton College. His teaching area includes sedimentary rocks and earth history with forays into energy and climate change. Over the past 20 years, Steve has participated in archaeological expeditions to the Sinai and Egypt and Israel as a team geologist with interest in reconstructing ancient landscapes. He served on the ASA Executive Council, including 2 years as president. Thank you very much. And most recently, a program co-chair for the 2021 annual meeting. In addition to the Grand Canyon book, Steve contributed to the textbook Understanding Scientific Theories of Origins, and also contributed to a book by Tremper Longman III, and thank you, Steve, and John Walton called The Lost World of Noah's Flood. He's also blogged for Biologos and Christian Scholars Review. We have also tonight Ralph Stearley. He's received his PhD in geosciences with an emphasis on paleontology at the University of Michigan. Go Blue, my alma mater. He's taught full-time at Calvin University from 1992. He retired 2 years ago in 2019 and now teaches part-time in retirement. I'm not sure how teaching part-time is actually retirement, but good on you, Ralph. He's undertaken field-based research on marine invertebrate ecology and paleoecology in the Northern Gulf of California, as well as the fossil record, systematics and evolution of salmonid fishes in Western North America. With the Calvin crew, he excavated a partial mastodon skeleton in Southwest Michigan in 1999. I remember that. And he was blessed to be able to co-author the volume, The Bible, Rocks and Time, with former Calvin colleague and friend Davis Young. Excellent book. And he also participated in this effort that led to the Grand Canyon book. And he's currently at work on a book about fossils going to be published by InterVarsity Press in the near future. Wayne Ranney is a geologist, author, and river trail guide living with his wife Helen in Flagstaff, Arizona. Hey, Wayne. He also works as an international guide with the Smithsonian Journeys travel program. During his 40-year career as a teacher and lecturer in and around the Grand Canyon and Colorado Plateau, he has mentored uncountable other landscape enthusiasts. He's got several books, including the award-winning Carving Grand Canyon, Evidence, Theories, and Mystery, Ancient Landscapes of the Colorado Plateau, and Sedona Through Time, a guide to Sedona's geology. We got Dr. Roger Wiens, also an ASA fellow, a Mars scientist, and an instrument developer for NASA. He's led the development of 2 generations of remote sensing laser instruments on the Curiosity and Perseverance rovers now operating on Mars. The French government knighted him for his work in forging strong ties between the French and American scientific communities and inspiring many young, ambitious Earthlings. Whether he's inspired the young, ambitious Martians, we will hopefully find out over the coming years. He's received other awards, including having an asteroid named after him, asteroid 417905, Wiens. He's an active writer and speaker, giving public talks each month, and we just thank him for his time and joining us tonight. He's got a web paper on radiometric dating, originally published over 20 years ago on the ASA website, and it has an annual readership, get this, of over 40,000 individual views. That's on an annual basis. So very influential. And he's also got a book called Red Rover, Inside the Story of Robotic Space Exploration from Genesis to the Mars Rover Curiosity, which describes his NASA team's space adventures. And last but not least, the man who herded the cats tonight, Ken Wolgamuth, also an ASA fellow and has had a 40-year career in the oil industry based on his graduate degree in geology and geochemistry. About 20 years ago, he was drawn into Christian worldview apologetics with a primary focus on the intersection of faith and science. He's founded Solid Rock Lectures to communicate the geological history of the earth for seminaries and the homeschooling community. Co-author of the Grand Canyon book, and he played a key role in its publication. So those are the brief biographies of our 9 panelists tonight. And I just cannot tell you how excited I am that we're going to be able to do this. Ken, you've got a question.
Comment, a mild correction in that, yes, I was involved, but the real cat chaser was Carol Hill. She was chasing we other 10 cats all over the web and communication and everything we had. So she was the real cat herder.
Yeah, my husband used to say every night when we were writing this book, he'd say, "Well, have you herded your cats today?" So that's about how I felt. No, they were all very good and easy to deal with. And we just had a really good time. And it's so nice to see them again. So awesome. Thank you for that.
All right. Well, let's get started with a panel discussion. We are right on time at 7:30 Eastern Daylight Time. Couldn't ask for better cat herding tonight, Ken and Carol. So, my first question for our 9 panelists, and Carol, I want to focus on you for a little bit. How did this idea for the Grand Canyon book come together, and how did you pick the contributors? How did you select them?
Well, actually, I started working in the Grand Canyon in 1998. Myself and especially Victor Pollock were from the UNM. He's our dating expert there. We started in 1998, and even in those early years, I had an idea of trying to write a book on the Grand Canyon that explained the real geology of Grand Canyon. There was the big problem that was of a publisher. The Christian publishers really didn't like the solid science that we were that exists there, and the secular publishers didn't want anything to do with Christians or their books. So essentially, I wasn't able to do anything until 2010, when I met, where are you, Gregg? Raise your hand. There's Gregg. When I met Gregg at a Geological Society of America meeting in 2010, and there was also the affiliation of Christian geologists meeting. So some of those people, including me and Gregg and Ken and so forth, went out to dinner before that meeting, and I happened to sit next to Gregg. Well, he's a Grand Canyon hiker, and I'm, working in the Grand Canyon. So we hit it off immediately. And we talked, of course, about the Grand Canyon, but also about the difficulty of trying to get anything published in either the Christian or secular world. So then he mentioned to me that he had just formed a new press, Malleus Press, that he was going to use to get some of what he wanted to publish out. And so that was enough to make me really excited. And I went home and I started contacting a number of the geologists that I already knew. And the first one I contacted was Ken. Raise your hand, Ken. There you are. Yeah. Was Ken. And he was at the time, he was working for the American Association of Petroleum geologist, and I knew him because I published two articles in the AAPG, one in Carlsbad Caverns that had a picture of the lake, the clouds on the cover, and one's about the location of the Hovey Channel, which led into the Delaware Basin. So I knew him from there. But I didn't actually get to meet him until I was working down in the Apache and Glass Mountains and went to a APG workshop, and I met him, and he was already talking about his solid lectures. And so I don't know, did you have that going by then, Ken?
Probably not quite yet. No.
Yeah, but you were talking about
it. I was in with you pretty quickly, I know.
Yeah, so you sent me stuff on that. Anyway, so that's how I met Ken. And then the next person I asked was Steve Moshier. Steve, where are you? Are you there? Hello? Yeah. And Steve and I have been friends for a long time. Way back, probably in the late 80s, we tried to write a manuscript on just on geology, and that didn't go anywhere because we had the big problem still with us. Nobody was willing to look at it, and that kind of evolved into the ASAs. I think it was called an Earth Science Primer. And so we kind of had a big chapter in there, but that fell through also, which never materialized. And then later, Steve and I wrote an article on PSCF on the flood geology of the Grand Canyon. We critiqued the flood geology in the Grand Canyon.
That was 2009, I think, 2009.
Was it? Okay. Yeah. All right. 2009. And then Roger Weens, where are you, Roger? Here. Can you wave? Where'd he go? Is he still on? Okay. Oh, there you are, Roger. Okay, way up in the left. I knew him because he and my son Larry both worked at Los Alamos Labs, and they also went to the same church. So whenever we'd go up to Los Alamos, of course, we'd see Roger. And at that time, I did find out that his website was getting, I thought, tens of thousands of hits. Was that right at that time, Roger?
I think you're talking about the ASA website.
Right, the ASA website.
Posted this radiometric dating paper called A Christian Perspective on it. And
so, of course, once he came to our church, where my husband Alan and I were teaching a science scripture class, and he talked to us about age dating. So I knew right away who I wanted to write the age dating chapter. So that's Roger. Now, how did I meet Wayne? Wayne, I met in the year 2000. It was the time when the Grand Canyon researchers decided to have the second symposium, the first on the Grand Canyon. And the first symposium was in 1964. And since that time, 64 to 2000, there was a whole new generation of geologists coming up. And so they decided to have this seminar at Grand Canyon Village. So Victor and I, we were the rookies, like I said, and we went there not knowing what to expect. We had only been working 2 years in the Grand Canyon. So we went there and heard a bunch of talks. And after they were all done, I thought, I like the talk by Wayne Rennie the best, because it made sense to me probably because Victor and I didn't know that much yet, but I mean, the way the logic he presented, And so that's got talking to Wayne afterwards, and we decided to do some field work up north of the canyon in what's called the Grand Staircase area. And we started working on the Kaibab Plateau and the Paria Plateau, tracing gravels down the Paria River and so forth, along with Doug Powell, who was the Grand Staircase geologist at the time. So really, he was one of my geologic colleagues that were working on the Grand Canyon. But little did I realize then that he was going to become an essential part of our Grand Canyon book, because we didn't even think of the Grand Canyon book then. And the reason he turned out to be such an essential part is that he's an absolutely wonderful photographer. And I'm going to show you here. You see this picture here? That's Wayne's picture. And I'll show you one more. And this is an aerial photo of the Butte Fault, actually. And it's just absolutely gorgeous. The other thing about Wayne was that he, as a photographer, he knew all the other professional photographers that took pictures of the Grand Canyon. So he contacted a lot of those photographers, and we got beautiful pictures for nothing or for a minimal price or whatever. So that's why if you have our book on the geology of the Grand Canyon there, you're going to see some beautiful, beautiful pictures. So that's how Wayne got into the pictures. So those are all people that I knew beforehand, before we started the Grand Canyon book. Now, when I went back from the GSA meeting and started to try to find other people, then I was looking at a number of publications that people had wrote. And the first one that I saw had just gotten Ralph Sterling and Davis Young's book, The Bible, Rocks, and Time. So I thought, this is the guy, Ralph Sterling, that I want to get involved. And so I called up Davis Young, because he was the one that got me in the ASA in the first place in 1984. So he gave me Ralph's telephone number. So I surprised Ralph by, right, he's shaking his head. He gets this call from a crazy woman. And anyway, but as soon as I said Davis Young, then he knew I was all okay. So that's how I got Ralph Sterling into the picture. And then the next person that I saw the article was Joel here, Joel Duff. Hi, Joel. Yeah, this is Joel Duff. And he's actually a biologist at the University of Akron. But anyway, the name of his article was Flood Geology's Abominable Mystery. And I said, well, what in the world is that about? What's so abominable? But anyway, it's the position that flood geology, that the Grand Canyon was formed all by Noah's flood, and the rocks in there formed in 1 year's time. And his point as a biologist was, there's no pollen at all. And here it's supposed to be 5,000 years ago. And yet, you know, where you have angiosperms and stuff like that, but there was nothing in the Grand Canyon. So that was abominable to him, I guess. And so I thought, well, you know, we really have to have this in our book. So then the next person was
Carol.
Tim.
Carol,
Yes.
I have to interject. You get to tell stories about us. I have a really quick Carol story.
Oh, okay.
And I have to tell everyone that particular paper would never have been published had it not been for Carol Hill. She was one of the reviewers of it, and I got some pretty harsh reviews. I mean, some very good reviews. And I have to admit, I was a little bit like, oh, this is going to be so much work. And she contacted me and encouraged me to continue to work on that paper. Yeah, you did. You did.
Okay,
and it made all the difference. And I want to tell people that the review process for Perspectives in Science and Christian Faith is a really sturdy peer review process. And some of the hardest work I've done is being able to publish papers there. So anyway, Carol, I really appreciate that.
Okay.
And that was my first interaction actually with Carol. And then she called me out of the blue for this.
Okay. All right. The next person that wrote an article in PSCF that I reviewed was that by Tim Helble. And it was called Sediment Transport in the Coconino Sandstone, a reality check on flood geology. And I reviewed his paper too, so I knew I wanted Tim to be a part of it, of this book. However, Tim became far more than just a co-author. He became our historian. He became our photo editor. He was the one that put together the whole reference section and also the index. So he really worked hard, really got into it. Now, I say he was the historian. What do I mean by that? He was the historian of all the young Earth creationist literature, from the early Creation Institute to the answers in Genesis. So he knew what the young Earths had said, young Earthers had said over the last 20, 25 years. And that turned out to be really, really important because we had to have those references in order to be able to refute what they were saying. We would have been criticized all up and down by them, or you don't know what we said or whatever, but Tim had all that information. So he was really our historian resource for that. Okay, let's see.
Anyway.
You want to say something, Tim?
I was going to say we got criticized anyway in spite of that.
Yeah, well, you can expect to get criticized. Right. Okay. The remaining two co-authors, David Elliott and Brian Tapp, were not recruited by me. Actually, Wayne was the one who knew about Dave Elliott. Now, Dave Elliott is probably the world's expert on trace fossils. So what are trace fossils? They're things like footprints and so forth that leave a trace of themselves. There's no bones, but they tell you about the activity of the organism. And Wayne had taken me and my son Larry and my grandson Daniel down to see the most spectacular footprints in the Coconino that you'll ever see. Not only footprints of reptiles, but of arthropods and spiders and stuff. There's one track that we saw that was actually a spider trap about 10 inches across. And there we're walking in the Permian Coconino sandstone, just much larger than they are today. So that's Dave Elliott's work. And he's also worked in Namibia in the desert there because he wants to know how those tracks get fossilized in the first place, what conditions you need to fossilize such delicate features as scorpion tracks and so forth. Then the remainder, so by that time we had everybody pretty much lined up, all the authors and stuff lined up, but we still didn't have a geophysicist to cover the structural geology and the plate tectonics. So again, it was Ken to the rescue. And he's an adjunct professor at Tulsa, University of Tulsa. And so he got Brian Tapp, who's a professor there, geophysicist there, to write those articles. They both wrote those two chapters together. So they're co-authors of that chapter. So that does it for all the co-authors. But there's one more thing I want to say about how the Grand Canyon finally came together and was published. It was the faith and perseverance of Ken Wohlgemuth and his wife, Helen. And, an all-colored book here, like this color book, Grand Canyon to a Monument to an Ancient Earth, is expensive to publish. And so Kregel was reluctant, but Ken went up to Michigan and talked to him and so forth. And then he started taking a rough draft of the manuscript, all in color, around to all of the oil geologist meetings and so forth. And being an oil geologist himself, he knew a lot of people. Some were just plain ordinary oil geologists, and some were very rich. So what he did was show these people, and he got the money to become, for Solid Rock Lectures, to become half of the publishers. So here on the back of the book, I don't know if you can see it down here, but you have Kregel and you have Solid Rock Lectures. And that's how we got the book published. So I think all of us other 10 co-authors know that we offer him a real thank you for doing that. And for the last 5 years, he's been taking any royalty money that comes in and puts it back into going to more places and selling more books. So now I think I know we sold the 5,000 for the first printing, but what is, Ken, can you tell us what might be about how many we've sold now?
I don't have as easy a opportunity to get information out of Kregel because our key person has left Kregel. So I know that the second printing was about 3,000, something like that. And I don't know where the status is. I will be seeing some Kregel folks here in November, and I'll try to sort of warm up to somebody and to try to get that. I'm not sure what the right timing is here, but we still have the piece that has to be put together of the total organizing the content, which was Gregg Davidson. So I don't, if you're calling that out, Mike, or are you passing that on now?
Yeah, I wanted to ask Gregg, the book's contents are extremely well laid out. And, it just lays the foundation for examining the general arguments for a relatively young Earth. And by relatively young, I mean within the last 6,000 to 10,000 years.
Before Gregg starts, I want to be sure to say, and he will elaborate, but I want to say it from my vantage point. He had the opportunity to have a sabbatical, and he took these writings from 10 other authors that were all over the place, and he disassembled everything, and he put the table of contents together, and without that, we would not have a book. So with that, I'm willing to pass it on to Gregg and tell his side of all that.
Yeah, that's the book's greatest strength, one of them anyway, that how methodically it's laid out. And so, Gregg, what inspired you to construct the book in this particular manner? Was it, trial and error in your own encounters, or was it, students in the classroom, struggling with, issues like the age of the Earth, or maybe being challenged on certain aspects of, presenting, the different facets of the Grand Canyon? What was it that inspired the way this was laid out?
So some dumb luck is not a sufficient answer?
No.
No. So the answer to that is kind of a funny story, because as Carol mentioned, my initial involvement in the book was that I had established this tiny little publishing company, not even a small publisher, a micro publishing agency company. And so that just kind of said, okay, when we get this stuff pulled together, it will have an avenue to get out to the public, even if it's not a traditional publisher. And of course, we did end up getting a traditional publisher, so we didn't need that. But it wasn't always clear what my part in the book was going to be. And initially, I think Ken and I may have put together a chapter. And then the next task was, as chapters were starting to be written, we started to do self-editing, where we would exchange the chapters and make edits and then send them back. And Carol recognized fairly quickly that I was a decent editor, that I was making some good comments and suggestions. So she ended up asking me to take on the general editor role for the text. And I was starting a sabbatical, as Ken Woolmuth mentioned, and I naively, emphasis on naively, thought, oh yeah, I've got a year. We can knock this out. 5 years later is when it was actually published. But so that started that process. And that just, one of my giftings, is, if you will, is putting together a logical thread to an argument, which is how I began to align all of the pieces of the book into the format that you see it. The biggest challenge was that when you've got 11 authors, they all have their own style, they all have their own desire for how much detail or how much technical language to put in. And we really wanted this to kind of speak with one voice. So my favorite story in that process, knowing that a previous ASA multi-author project went up in flames because people just, during this process that we're talking about, there was just so much acrimony that they finally had to abandon the project. So knowing that history and trying to be sensitive to that, there was one chapter that my good friend Ralph Sturley submitted that had a lot of technical language, more so than the other chapters. So I'm going in and I'm kind of taking out some of the technical language and making it, kind of editing it so that it flows more for a general audience, and sent it back to Ralph. And
I remember crying all night after that.
Yeah. So yeah. I get this.
Gregg was very brutal.
I get this email from Ralph that he was not very happy with what I'd done. And I didn't respond right away. And the next morning he calls me and he's apologetic. He's like, I feel bad about the tone of my email. I'm sorry about that. And I told him, I said, Ralph, when I read your email, I said, if that's all the more mad he is, we're doing great. And we had a good laugh. So,
well, Gregg, we all found it incredibly annoying, your editing. I always thought, Carol and I have very different writing styles, and we worked really hard, didn't we, Carol, to come to the kind of agreement on that one ASA paper. So she would send me stuff, I would rewrite it, we sent it to you, and you rewrote everything. So, and it's a better book for it. So God bless you.
Yeah. Thanks, Gregg.
Now I know Tim, played that special role in being the historian of, young Earth flood geology arguments. Tim, how did you weave that into the book that Gregg was, cobbling together from all these disparate voices?
Well, that's a good story. I actually got involved in the book starting in 2009, June. I started exchanging emails with Carol. And I had a question about her article that she and Steve had written, and it was the photo of the peat sandstone. And that's one of the claims that the young earthers use, that rocks are fold or bent, but they're not fractured. And so I was asking her a question about that. And then I said, would you take a look at this stuff I've been developing on the Grand Canyon, which had my Coconino sandstone argument in it about how depositing all the layers is basically volumetrically ridiculous. And she said, well, you ought to consider being involved in this book that I've been thinking about for a while. But anyway, in November of 2009, after some emails with her and Wayne, and I believe Steve was involved in some of those, they said, you should compile a list of all the flood geology claims about the Grand Canyon. So I went through all my books. I could show you some of the, or all of them on my shelf if I want. Nah, let's not do that. People get dizzy. Came up with 21 pages of flood geology arguments about the Grand Canyon, and sent them out to Carol and Wayne. That was in November, I believe, 2009. And that's basically how I got involved in the book, in those arguments. Some of them we didn't end up addressing because there's just so many, 21 pages, but we got the major ones and we covered them really well. I think Gregg really organized stuff well into the final chapter structure, and it really all came together. I'd say that sometimes it was necessary to ensure that the authors address the claims. Sometimes the initial drafts didn't fully address them, so I had to send a lot of emails out about that, and we got all that addressed eventually. And it was a lot of fun. It was like you were saying at the start, though, Carol, about herding cats. It was, Carol felt like she was herding cats, and I felt like I was herding cats, and Gregg felt like he was herding cats, and Steve felt like he was herding cats. And yeah, it was like just like that Super Bowl commercial, with all the cats running around.
I really loved working with Tim. We would sketch things out, fax them back together. This is just an example. This is the kind of a use of the old rock cycle, but using the Grand Canyon is the example. And I know we had many, many versions of this, but then we were able to use the individual frames in some of the other parts of the book. And there's just so many. And as a teacher, my gosh, I use a lot of those illustrations, including illustrations we never used that he made.
Yeah, there was one I did Steve really liked, and he said, "Can I use this for something else?" I said, "Sure."
We did. We took a discarded illustration from the Canyon book and put it in the Theories of Origins book. So, I mean, I just have continued to use material that he generated, and it was just a blast to work with you.
That was my favorite one here.
That was, yeah.
That was the first one I did up there in the top. I had so many iterations of that thing, but I really loved the layout of that page, how it came out.
It's really important.
Well, and one of the nice things about the that particular cartoon of the whole Grand Canyon and the Grand Staircase is what Tim's showing there is that we then did excerpts where anytime we were talking about a particular place in the canyon, we would have a little excerpt of that with arrows that would show so the readers could see exactly where we were in the sequence. Because one of the things that I was always a little bit frustrated about whenever I'd read some kind of whether it was a scientific report or something for the general public, and they're talking about these various layers, and you're trying to keep track of where are all these things in the canyon. So to be able to have a little icon, a little arrow that says, here's where we're at in the canyon for this discussion was really helpful.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask the next couple of questions, but before I start, I just want to say how thrilled I am that you're all here. I actually have met, I'm just counting 5 or 6 of you. 5 of the authors I've met at ASA meetings. I remember meeting Gregg. We bumped into each other I think at the dormitory, and we realized who we each were. And one of the reasons was because we both had books coming out from Kregel on the same day that year. I don't know if you remember that, Gregg. And I've also, met Ken and Tim Helble at other places, Steve several times, Joel once, I think it was at a BioLogos meeting, and Carol I've spoken to on the phone. So, I really feel blessed to see all of you here. And I'll just say that geology is not my strong point. I'm a molecular biologist. So even Joel's biology is a little hard for me. But I love the book, of course, as almost everybody who's read it has. And thankfully, you don't have to be a geologist to love the book. But that brings me to the question that is sort of one of the most important ones of the evening, I think, and that relates to the impact the book has had in the 5 years since it's been published. And so that's sort of a general question. How would you rate the impact in general? And then if you want, maybe more specifically, have you had any feedback from other geologists, perhaps non-Christian geologists, about the book? And what about Christian and Science communities, organizations? Have they given you feedback? So it's a general question about the impact of the book, how you measure it, and what kind of feedback you've had in these 5 years. And I see Ken is the first one up. Go ahead, Ken.
Well, before we do that transition, I want to highlight, you've all looked at the book and you've paged through it and you see this spectacular photography. Tim Helble spent, I don't know how many months finding all those photographs. And we did invest about $6,000 in professional photography in terms of royalties to photographers. Professionals typically gave us 1 or 2 photos for free, but then we paid that. That was part of our fundraising project. So the photography is Tim Helble. And one of the stories I love to remember is that as my wife and I were driving into the Grand Canyon for our book signing in 2016, I called one of the photographers that lives near the canyon. And I asked him if he had gotten his copy. And he gave me this, wow, that is a fabulous book. And I'm thinking, did you think that your photo was going to go into maybe a second tier book? And he said, well, yeah, that's what I expected. So anyway, that's a little punch that fits right here and complements to Tim Helble's endless hours. So between Tim endless hours in photography and Gregg Davidson endless hours in organizing, now we can go on and get to the impact.
Okay, who wants to start? You want to start, Ken, since you're already...
No, I want to be sure to hear from Wayne Ranney particularly, and others on that one. I'll say some things later, but...
Okay.
Well, thank you, Ken, for calling me out on this. I'm probably one of the authors that lives the closest to the Grand Canyon, so I get to see the book on the shelf, and I always check to make sure that it's there. And hats off to Grand Canyon Conservancy for carrying the book there at Grand Canyon National Park. And that's probably where a lot of the sales happen. I also interact with a lot of professional geologists. And to start out, they're a little bit put off by the subtitle with Noah's flood in the subtitle. And I think all of my co-authors will agree that this was really something that we spent a lot of time going back and forth. And all of us remember that because we had different iterations of it. The second one that wasn't chosen is why Noah's flood cannot explain the Grand Canyon. And it was decided by the group that that was a negative statement and we didn't want to have that as a subtitle. So I will say that initially, in my experience, professional geologists are initially put off when they see that subtitle. But if they go into the book, they change their mind immediately, because this book not only explains what flood geology is, but it's really a primer on traditional geology. And you can learn a lot about sedimentary rocks, radiometric dating, landscape development. It really could be a textbook in an introductory geology class. And the people that I have given the book to or sent them on to have all come back to me. I've never heard a negative thing about the book. It's the photography, it's the way it's laid out, but I think more importantly, the way that Gregg and the other editors really went through and showed how when you try to put together a coherent story about flood geology, it doesn't hold water, if you'll pardon the pun. There's just so many things that are not connected, and these sound bites and these one-liners that a lot of them say just don't have a coherent story. And that's the main strength of the book in my mind, is the way that if you're a flood geologist, you have to be scratching your head after seeing this book.
Wayne, do you visit into the bookstore every once in a while, and would you have enough rapport to ask sort of the book manager what the summary sales were, say, for last year at the end of December?
Well, I think that was true before the pandemic, but the visitor center has been closed for a long time, and they have opened the bookstore again where the book is being sold. But, you know, related to that is that the employees are all new. And so anytime I do go into the bookstore, my wife and I always go up to the person who's there at the counter and make them aware of the book, and we explain what the book is.
Oh, thank you.
And it is a constant thing that we have to do because the turnover in employees is so great. But once we do that, then, you know, if they get a question at the front desk, is there anything about Noah's flood, then the employees can send them on to our book.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment on why we finally, mainly it was Ken and I that chose to say, can Noah's flood explain the Grand Canyon? Because we knew it would be a turnoff to professional geologists, but that wasn't really the people that we had in mind. We had the general public, but even more specifically, the young Earth creationists who were taking vans around the South Rim and taking river trips, you know, down the canyon, and they were influencing so many Christians. So if we had said why the Noah's flood cannot explain the Grand Canyon, they wouldn't pick up the book. We knew that staunch young Earth creationist over here would never ever buy the book. And then you've got, you know, the geologist over here, but we were going for the middle, more of the middle ground, that if people, even if they weren't Christians, they were being influenced by what the young Earth creationists said. So we posed it as a question so that we would get that very vulnerable audience, public audience, and try to steer at least some of them toward, well, I'm going to think about it. And even some of the guides, you know, they said, well, you know, I'm raised in a Christian home, or I don't know what to think. And so they say, they'll tell them, you go to that book and read it. So that was the rationale. And I've had misgivings in the past. We probably could have sold a lot more copies if we hadn't. But that, to me, that's the reason why I wanted to start the book in the first place, to reach the not the diehard young Earth creationists. Don't worry about them; they'll never change. But for the people that were being sucked in by the young Earth creationists and leading all these crazy trips to the rim and telling people that the whole thing formed in Noah's flood. So that's why essentially Ken and I think, were the staunch two that felt that we really should continue it for this particular audience.
I'd like to tell a story if I could. I was doing some investigative work at a museum in Kentucky that's shaped like a boat. I don't know if you've heard about it. And I was in the bookstore, and I got talking with a young guy, and it just came out why I didn't agree with the stuff. And I got out my cell phone and I showed him the Amazon, link to the book. And I really think he might have bought it because it certainly wasn't going to be in the bookstore that we were in there.
I want to ask Joel. I think he's been waiting to make a comment. Joel?
Yeah, I think that's truly the legacy of the book. I think it's pastors, it's youth pastors, it's individuals who are in churches and they have questions. They're in school, they hear other things, they're really seekers, and they want to know, like, how can I really get my hands around this story? What's a good way to understand why there are Christians that believe that the earth is ancient? And this puts right in front of them a cohesive, laid out story that's easy to understand. You can appreciate science. It glorifies God at the same time. It doesn't confront them in a way that makes them want to just pull back. They're willing to learn because of the attitude and the way that the book is written. And that's where I see the biggest impact. I have given it to individuals in my church who all they've ever known is young earth creationism, but they're not necessarily, completely devoted to that. They just don't know anything else. And when they start to read and see that there are serious Christians and others who can lay this story out for them in this compelling way, it makes them ask questions. It doesn't instantly change someone's mind, but it opens up that ability to now say, oh, do you have other, we can talk now. And I think it leads to those conversations. And I've seen that. And by the way, I was at the Grand Canyon bookstore in January of 2020, right before the pandemic. And when I entered the bookstore, it was at the front, sitting up in a so maybe Steve, you got to him. It's right up there in the front. And it was also in the back, but they had it in a special position. And when we were looking at it, the folks working there came over and was like, yeah, that's a great book, even without us saying anything. And I said, well, yeah, I'm an author on this book. And they were so excited. They were just like, we recommend this book to people. I think it's a really awesome book. And so I was really encouraged by that. I wasn't expecting that, but it was really nice to see them very excited about the book and understanding sort of like what the purpose of why that book was there compared to some of the other books that they have, because they see those individuals come in and they can direct them if they know to a book like that.
Right.
I think
that's fascinating. Roger, go ahead.
Yeah, to follow up on that, this is a great book because it fits in a natural progression of literature, and so here is something in a Christian perspective, or largely Christian perspective, looking at the science, but then it would leave questions in people's minds. But there are books that are out there now that really address where Christians can go from here. One of them being Carol Hill's book that was published by the very same publishing house just a few years later. And then there's also books like John Walton's The Lost World of Genesis and the Flood and so on, which I guess, Stephen, you also contributed to one of those. So it's great that we have this whole progression. And thanks so much, Carol, for writing your book after this as well.
Oh, thanks.
I would add to that Gregg's book, Friend of Science, Friend of Faith, which covers a lot of other similar ground, talking about young earth creationism and its alternatives. Okay. So since we're talking about this, we've already mentioned the young earth creationists and their attitudes. So one of the questions is, has anyone had interactions with young Earth creationists about the book? In other words, have there been any debates or either formal or informal or discussions with people from AIG or ICR about this whole issue based on the book? Steve, I saw you nodding your head. Did you have some experience like that?
Yeah, let me unmute here. Yes, in 2017, the Evangelical Theological Society, based on the book, created a session. And I don't know how I ended up, but I ended up being the presenter, and Steve Austin, who used to be with ICR, was the other presenter. So we had an opportunity to, both give like a 15, 20-minute talk, and then we had a discussion. Now, Gregg Davidson had done a similar thing at ETS a few years before with Andrew Snelling. I kind of felt like the discussion that Andrew and Gregg had was a lot more useful than the one I had with Stephen. Maybe I'm just not as good at it as Gregg, but I remember the first thing Stephen said was, well, the first thing I want to know is, why do you trivialize my work? And I got a laugh. And then I said, well, I guess it's because we disagree with you. I think that was my answer. And I don't know. That's one of those out of body experiences when you're, in front of a bunch of people and you just have no idea what's coming out of your mouth. So whatever, maybe the Holy Spirit did spoke for me, but that was a really cool opportunity. And the video, there's a video that BioLogos made. And Ken was very instrumental in that. He did the sound recording, and then BioLogos did the video, and they put it together. So if you go to the BioLogos website, their YouTube website, you can find that presentation. Well, my goodness, Ralph was there. I'm so sorry. Ralph was there, and he had a dual presentation with Ross, help me here. Marcus Ross. So you might, because that was also part of the thing. So you might want to follow up on that, what I just said.
Yeah, and actually, I think the dialogue between me and Marcus went very, very well.
It did.
It was very respectful, and in fact, I had known Marcus from a couple of years earlier, and we actually purposefully got together at the GSA meeting in October. The prior to this November meeting, and I basically laid out, this is what I'm going to do. And he kind of told me what he was going to do. And I mean, we were kind of prepped to treat each other civilly. Mm-hmm. So that went very well. And like Steve mentioned, that's also on YouTube.
Yep.
And I know it's had hits, and I've also recommended it to people who are maybe say they've come to Calvin with a potential student and they want to know, what do you teach? And I said, well, you can see a lecture here. And so it's generating ripples. The book is generating ripples that are going out. Yeah.
Real quick, Wayne, I know you have to leave. You're doing your first Grand Canyon backpack to the bottom tomorrow morning, nice and early. And congratulations on your bilateral knee replacement surgery a couple of years ago. This is going to be the first test ride of those new joints. And I just want to give you the opportunity and the floor to have the last word from you. Not for the whole thing tonight, but just what you got.
Well, I wore my knees out backpacking in the Grand Canyon, all the backpacks that I led as a trail guide. And so I want to wear out these replacement ones as soon as I can. So I'm starting on it tomorrow. But I just want to thank all of my co-authors and co-editors for this book. It really has been a joy to work on, and it's a joy to present to people even to this day. And just thanks to all of you. Thanks for participating tonight, to all of you that were listening. And I'll say goodbye at this time. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
Wayne.
And thank you, Wayne. Thank you for carving some time with your trip tomorrow.
Was that carving a statement, Ken, a geology joke? No. Okay.
Hey, I was going to
I
say,
knew he was short of time. I'm just thankful he gave us some.
It's a geological metaphor that creeps in everywhere.
Hey,
Roger.
since we're changing subject a little bit, I just wanted to mention that I can't remember if it was the year after or 2 years after the publication of the Grand Canyon book, and I can't remember all the details either. I'm one of those cats that got herded because I was so busy doing too many other things, mostly Mars. But there was a session proposal for the Geological Society of America. And the GSA is one of the main conferences for geologists in the US. And this ended up being, I think, just a really, really neat time, especially for me, at least, at GSA, because most of this session was accepted. It was about how to engage the public or the religious public on matters of science. And so there were two topics there. One was on climate warming, and the other was on things like young Earth. And so we spent, actually, the session went the whole morning, and the room was packed the whole time. And so, I mean, my hook into this whole thing is that when I got into I grew up as a. I'll just backtrack here a little bit. I grew up as a believer, and that I never saw, any incongruency with science until I started running into these young Earth people. Basically, when I moved to San Diego when I was doing a postdoc. So then I wrote this whole missive on radiometric dating, and it ended up in the ASA's website. But so that's my hook into this, and that's what I gave the talk at the GSA as well. But I was able to really just talk about why do we believe science, and why do we believe in our faith as well, and others did the same thing, talking about how they have presented sessions on science in their churches and other things. And it was just a really powerful thing, because I saw, in my mind, at least in the audience, many graduate students, many other people who were wondering what to do with their faith, or the faith they grew up with and were about to leave, and so on. And here were these people who are geologists who could talk about this in GSA and in this major scientific conference. And so I wanted to also thank, and I can't remember who all organized that, whether that was Gregg and Ken and Carol, or who did it, but it was a really powerful time that followed this book as well.
Thanks for
Yes,
that.
I just wanted to dovetail. The room was packed. We got a lot of good, appreciative comments. I had people come up to me afterwards asking me to sign the book. And some of those were homeschoolers who had to teach their high school kids science, and they almost had tears in their eyes. They were so grateful for the book. So there were a lot of professional geologists in that room, and there also were a lot of science teachers in that room as well.
And I wonder if we could do it again sometime.
And I also might mention that a couple of years after that, there was an article in GSA Today, which was authored by Gregg, and was it Gregg and Steve, or who was it exactly? That talked about.
I think Gregg and I.
Gregg and you.
Talking about the Gregg and I.
Yeah.
And
So
Ken.
there was.
I think it was.
Yeah.
I think it was Ken and.
Oh, and
Carol
Ken too. Yeah.
So there was a springboard article that reached the entire membership of the GSA a few years later. That basically it wasn't an overt commercial for the book, but it certainly exposed, if people hadn't been exposed to it before, it certainly exposed, several thousand professional geologists to the book.
Well, and a very brief story about that. So the gist of that article was trying to tell the geologic community that their best bet for reaching the religious public was to tap scientists of faith to be liaisons to their own faith-based communities, because there's a measure of trust there,
Mm-hmm.
that the just atheistic scientists are not gonna have with them. So when we wrote that and first submitted it, took them a long time to get back, and eventually the senior editor of the journal told me that when he first got that short manuscript, he hated it, just wanted to find a way to get rid of it. And his assistant editor convinced him to go ahead and take it seriously, make suggestions for edits. They sent that to us. We made the edits, and he said, he actually told me, he said, "Thank you for changing my mind."
Wow. Well, I've got another question about changing minds. So thank you for that segue, Gregg. Now, tucked away at the bottom of the book's very first page, at the page that contains a few endorsements of the book, is Proverbs 18:17, which reads, "The one who states his case first seems right, until the other comes and examines him." So for me, I grew up as a young Earth creationist, and it wasn't until my mid-30s that I had significant exposure to other viewpoints regarding the age of the Earth. In fact, it was my experience as a naval aviator that helped me realize that I had been viewing the issue from about 30,000 feet up, and I was unable to see, the detail that would have challenged my thinking. So, I asked the remaining 8 panelists here tonight, did any of you grow up in a young Earth creationist paradigm? And if so, when did the other come and cross-examine your beliefs? Floor is open to the panelists. It could be a very short question. Did all of you grow up as old Earth creationists?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so since I don't think any of us grew up in young Earth homes, so I'll give an answer that maybe comes the closest to an aha idea or moment, that I didn't grow up hearing either. So I didn't grow up hearing that the Earth was young. I didn't grow up hearing the Earth was old. We were just encouraged to read scripture and study it. We were encouraged to go out and look at nature and study it. My father in particular was fond of being a Berean, where you, as the apostle, I think it was Paul in Acts, talking about that the Bereans were more noble-minded, or more noble than the Thessalonians, because they didn't just believe what he said, they actually went back and searched the scriptures to see if it was so. So that was kind of an attitude I grew up with my parents saying, you don't believe somebody just because they claim to be an authority. You go and you actually investigate it. So I grew up with that kind of freedom, so that as I encountered the various arguments, I was naturally drawn to the ones that made the most sense, both biblically and scientifically.
I would just echo those sentiments, and I'll just say that my father is actually in this room here. So he's a pastor, and so I grew up in the church. We lived in Western Colorado, and I don't remember ever having real conversations about this topic, or being like, here's what you need to believe. But we certainly took plenty of trips out into the backwoods of Colorado and looked at a lot of rocks and collected a lot of fossils, and so it just exposed to the world that way, and then being brought up to be able to think critically and think biblically and analyze those things. I don't remember ever really. I remember thinking about, okay, I need to think through these things as I heard new ideas when I went to college and so forth. But I think the foundation of my biblical upbringing, along with the exposure really to nature, because my father really appreciates and really loves the creation as well. Those two things right there just sort of led me to, where I'm at right now. So thanks, Dad.
Yeah, and I should have thrown in that, so Joel's dad was a pastor. Both my grandfathers were Assembly of God pastors, and my dad was a biology teacher at a community college. So I had both sides of that.
Now, my father was a chemistry major at Calvin College before going on to Westminster.
I was a mainline Presbyterian raised, and so there was no real position taken, although just literalness of interpretation was usually kind of frowned on. But then I left that church and started hanging out with evangelicals in the late 70s, and Calvary Chapel especially, which is a pretty well-known non-denominational church. And I remember going to one of the Wednesday night Bible studies, and they had a guest speaker named Harold Schlusser, which was a guy that actually, I think he went to the University of Arizona, and apparently he had a fake degree or something. Later on, I found out about that, but he talked about astronomy and how it pointed to a young Earth. And I remember at the end of the talk, Pastor Chuck Smith, he leaned up on the podium and he says, "That makes sense." And of course, Chuck Smith is kind of revered as a modern day prophet or something, and it's almost cult-like or something. But so anyway, I became sort of Middle Earth, if that's such a thing, you know. I sort of tried to straddle both, you know, young Earth and old Earth, and I could sort of argue both sides and convince both people that I was on their side. And I think what made me realize that the young Earth position was not even close to tenable was after working at the Grand Canyon and looking at the layers. And I used to think to myself, well, I suppose they could have all been laid down by Noah's flood. I started to work out the math, what would be involved in doing that. What would the volumes have to be in order to accomplish that kind of thing? And they were just totally absurd. And so now there's beyond absurd. Huge slabs of sediment would have to be sliding across the country in just incredibly short amounts of time. And so anyway, that kind of thing sort of swayed me away from my Middle Earth view and back into the old Earth camp.
Thanks, Tim. I've got a question for anyone who's got an answer. Have there been any schools or homeschooling organizations that have adopted this particular book as part of their geology or earth science curricula?
You know, Kevin Nelstead is in the group, and he might be the one who could tell us that best. Kevin, can you? Because Kevin heads up an online homeschooling effort and has written a book himself. So
I don't see. Oh, Kevin. Kevin
I
Nelson.
I see his icon, but I don't know if he's listening.
Kevin, are you out there?
He was. Yeah, he's still here.
Well, if Kevin comes back, we'll let him.
He's gone to get a snack or something.
Yeah, I can make one comment. There is one homeschooling group, and at Charlotte Mason Institute has adopted our Grand Canyon book as part of their curriculum. And I was privileged to be able to connect with the organizers of that homeschool material and make recommendations sort of through the whole sequence and see how they are integrating the Grand Canyon book for their homeschooling content.
There's also an organization called Old Earth Homeschool, and I don't know a whole lot about them, but maybe one of the others does. So I'm assuming they would have advocated for that book too.
Anyone else? Is Kevin out there still with us?
His icon is.
Let me ask him to unmute. See if that works.
He must have slipped away.
Okay. Well, I think it's about time to open up the floor to general questions and answers from the audience. And if you would please, if you've got a question, go ahead and hover your cursor over the screen and you'll see a little buttons appear down at the bottom, and you can hit the reactions button like I am and use the raise hand button. Anyone out there? Question.
I do see somebody on the screen here who has written one of the comments about the book that I've really appreciated, and I put it in some of my emails. And that is, he said that this book is possibly the very best book that somebody could get to learn how geology is done from day to day in terms of understanding the history of a geological era without going to take a Geology 101 course at the local university. And that's Scott Buchanan, who's sitting there. He has a chemistry background, and he gave us that wonderful high praise that I read. So thank you for joining us, Scott.
Yes, you guys slaked my curiosity as far as a lot of details on how sedimentary rocks form and reform. So I had these questions in my mind from my partial reading, and this book really pulled it together. Great job.
Barry, go ahead and unmute yourself. Okay, Barry, we can't hear you, so keep that question in mind. See if you can work out a technical difficulty on your end. Robert, you've got a question in the chat box. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask in person?
Okay, yeah, I'll use my mic. Can I hear? Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Well, let me first say this, that I'm a Christian in Australia. I've been a Christian for about 5 years, and this entire panel has been very therapeutic for me because, we do have AIG's influence still in Australia, and I'm in the sciences myself. I'm currently doing a master's, and I'm an introvert, so I sort of very rarely engage with Christians who are, they're interested in the intellectual side of Christianity, and this is nothing but sort of like, it's just therapeutic for me because it's, this is just giving a taste of people around the world that have a high honor for God and the Bible, and yet are also just wonderful professionals in various scientific fields. So it's just a big inspiration for me. Okay. So then my question is, one of the authors of the book, I forget who, but on your Facebook, you reminded everyone about Terry Mortison's review from AIG. And so yeah, when I open the PDF, it's like 40 or 50 pages long, or some just a ridiculous, just this massive review. And it, reading through that was quite tedious because he just sort of like rambles off into all these tangent points, and so even though the book has been well received, and it's some schools, some education departments are actually now using it in part of their curriculum and so on. So should your energy and your time be focusing on that, or are reviews like Terry's reviews sort of making headway more so than ever before in the young earth community, or younger churches or whatever? Like should you take the time to respond to reviews like his? Yeah.
So if I had a big sign that I could hold up that said "no!" exclamation point and rock it back and forth, I'd do that right now. So I won't swear that I'm answering for everyone, but as a campus minister years ago told me that that the calling was to be fishers of men, not fishers of fishermen. So our audience, our target audience, the people we're trying to reach, are not these hardcore people who have made a virtual religion out of belief in a young earth. So to try to respond to everything that they write is the proverbial whack-a-mole exercise, where as fast as you could write a rebuttal, they'd write a rebuttal of a rebuttal.
Yeah.
And
Or they,
and they're
or they
actually
bring up another smoke screen, a different smoke
yes.
screen. Yeah.
And what they're writing, you have to keep in mind that their objective is not an actual rebuttal. Their objective is to have something that sounds scholarly, that is long, and gives the impression of making a convincing argument against what's been written, so that they can tell their supporters, we address that.
Yes. What that
And then
review,
a lot of their people won't even bother reading it because they just have the confidence that, oh, it's been addressed.
They won't read the Grand Canyon book either.
Right.
So they won't know whether Mortensen's fairly reviewing it or not. They'll just take his word for it.
but I will say the very existence of that review tells us that we are making an impact, because I think their initial response was to ignore for the most part. Right? There were very few actual written reviews or anything said about the book. I think the fact that they felt compelled to have Mortensen write such a large dramatic review suggests that they're getting questions. People are asking them, what do you think of this book? And I've heard of this book, and somebody showed this to me, and they feel like they have to say something as a result. So I just took that review as like confirmation that they feel threatened and they need to have some kind of response. And Gregg's exactly right. It just exists so they can just point to and say, there's the answer, because it's answers, and there's our answer. That we don't have to talk about it anymore.
If you look at Mortensen's review, he openly admits in the front, he says, I'm only reviewing the first 2 chapters, I think he said, of the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, chapters
Exactly.
I wrote.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he didn't
I was disappointed. He didn't say anything about my part.
Yeah. And he didn't even review chapter 3, which is the one that summarizes what is flood geology. And I would have thought he would at least have, told us if we reviewed flood geology, if we summarized it correctly. But all the authors, we exchanged a few emails after that came out, and we just kind of, people were asking each other, is anybody going to review this? And we all just kind of thought, we all just kind of shook our heads in email, basically. And there was another review that came out shortly after the book came out by the Creation Ministries International, which is the split off version of Answers in Genesis. And that came out what did it come out still 2016 or was it 2017? I forget, but I started to produce a review of their review, and I just kind of just dropped it. It got too long. There's this principle that you've heard of on the internet. I won't have to use all the words, but it takes like 10 times as much effort to refute nonsense as it does to write nonsense. So it's just a tremendous amount of work.
In Steve Austin's talk, when we both talked at ESA, he made a big fuss about how we handled cross-bedding in the Coconino. Does anyone, maybe Tim, could comment on that? Because I know John Whitmer just felt like we were ignoring the basic field data that he had because of the way that we reported cross-bedding in the Coconino.
Well,
that's really been the only big scientific question.
Yes. So let me jump in on one thing there. That part of that there was a mistake in the first printing of the book that is my fault. That was a chapter that Wayne and I wrote, and that there were other sources that talked about cross-bedding being at angles up to 34 degrees, and we realized that was wrong for the Coconino sandstone, and everywhere else in the book that got corrected to say up to 30 degrees. And there's one spot in that late chapter that somehow snuck through, and oh my, did they zero in on that mistake as we were making false statements. And it did get corrected for the second printing. So I'll from there, Tim, you can pick it up.
Yeah. I got a phone call from Steve Austin in 2012, I think it was. And he was going to respond, he said, to my article about the Coconino sandstone, and he never did. So, but in the call, he said that I think it was deposited in 40 days and 40 nights. and which is kind of silly. I mean, that's a big chunk out of the flood year just for one formation. But he said it was done by these gravity currents, and it's interesting because in his talk that he did at the ETS with Steve Moshier, he was back to presenting that it was deposited by migrating underwater sand waves. So it's kind of like, what's your position? Is it submarine liquefied gravity currents, or is it sand waves that are moving across the bottom during the flood? So it's really hard to pin him down on anything on that issue. And the other thing I was going to say was I am working on another book. It'll probably just be a freebie PDF kind of thing with some other people, including some geologists on the Coconino Sandstone. So we're looking at Whitmore's claims. And I guess the one thing I noticed really quick is that the flood geologists always neglect to try to refute the strongest claim against their position. They'll try to knock down everything else, but they'll always neglect to try to respond to the best position against their position. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, we've got a question from my friend Nick Tavani. He is one of the local chapter leaders of Reasons to Believe here in the DC area. Nick, the floor is yours. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, this is Nick. Hi, this is Nick Tavani. Really enjoying this talk tonight. I love this book, and I have a huge respect for what it takes now to make a book. We take it for granted. And all of you did a wonderful job. This is going to be around for a long time. I wanted to mention two things. Number one, as far as who supports this book, Reasons to Believe is solidly behind it. I think it's even on their website, and it's a very useful tool in Reasons to Believe. Second thing is, I think, Ken, you're going to know this name when I mentioned Nate Loper. Does that ring a bell?
It sure does.
Okay. He is a young earther who does leads tours through the Grand Canyon. I met him a number of years ago, and we're friends. I've maintained a friendship with him via Facebook, and I just wanted to make this point. I think our way of reaching them, that is young earthers, is going to be not just in discourse on the topics, but on a relationship level. And it's not easy, but to try to find areas that you can talk about to establish some things. And I managed to get that conversation going. Every so often I will gently ask something about the Grand Canyon, and he'll respond. But when I mention the book or mention Ken's name, I really see that it gets his spur up. But that means that it really is getting to him. Otherwise, he wouldn't be that way. So I want you to know, pray for me. I'm trying to relate to him. If we win him and others like him, it will have a huge influence. And I think it's going to happen as the Lord is behind it. Anyway, God bless all of you, and thanks for a great evening. Thanks, Mike.
My wife and I treated Nick Tavani to dinner in Flagstaff and to lunch. And we had a long conversation. We talked about the book, and he said he was going to study some geology. But as I continue to watch him, it doesn't look as though he's ever going to do that. So, Nick, let's talk. Give me a call sometime, and let's talk of how we can reach out to Nick.
It's Nate Loper.
Nate, yeah, excuse me. Yep, Nate.
But yeah, I will gently bring that up with him and see where he's at with it. Okay, thanks for telling me.
Thanks, Nick.
Mike?
Yes.
I'm going to have to leave in a little bit to take care of my husband. He's in a walker and so forth and needs some help. But can I just close by showing my worldview book?
Absolutely, especially since I grabbed the wrong book before, but yes, please.
Well, that's okay. Yeah, it's not, this is just written by me, not any other author. And it's been out since November 2019 and available, of course, on Amazon.com and so forth. But the real, I guess, reason for me writing this was because I was trying to come to a way of interpreting scripture that would make sense to me, that would make sense to other scientists. And the only way I found was to take a worldview approach that you can't force modern science onto the Bible. There's no modern science at all in the Bible. You have to go by the worldview of the people who wrote the chapter. That's very important. In other words, the biblical text of Genesis is dualistic nature. It has a historic core, but on that core, you have embedded in it, you have the pre-scientific, pre-literate view of the Mesopotamians. And what people do in these debates, like the non-Christians, Christians, they're arguing the science and stuff. And I would say, hey, why are you're just arguing past each other because you're not considering the worldview of the people that really, really, wrote the text. You have to stop and think that those were oral stories that were passed down for maybe 2,000 years. Writing didn't come in, narrative writing didn't come in until 2,500 to 2,000 BC. So how can you argue science because there is no science there? So that's kind of where I started out, and then I took the 8 most controversial, subjects like the days of Genesis and the Garden of Eden and the numbers of chronologies of Genesis and so forth, and tried to interpret it from the people who actually wrote it, and not just culture. Worldview isn't culture, it's the mindset of the people. And for example, now, today, we don't have the mindset of people in Iraq and Iran or Afghanistan or whatever, but you got to go back 6,000 years. You're just forcing modern science onto the Bible, and it isn't there. And once you take a worldview approach, then things start falling into place. For example, like Adam and Eve, the worldview approach considers them to be historical people, the Garden of Eden, a historical place, the numbers of Genesis as both numerical and numerological. And once you do that, like Noah's 600 years old, it says when the flood started. But what people don't realize is that was a sexagesimal system. And base 60, they considered the numbers 60 and 600 perfect and sacred. So for Noah, who was perfect in his generations, how can you give him a number of 74 or something? That's just the way they looked at numbers. And that carries all the way on through to evolution and so forth. They knew nothing whatsoever about evolution, and you can't force that on the Genesis text. They had a whole different way of looking at things. So I guess that's all I want to say. I'm sorry, I need to go here. Anyway, I think Gregg has a new book out too that he probably wants to say something about. Okay, I haven't gotten it yet, Gregg. But
Hey, Carol, I just want to say that we are blessed by your presence and blessed by the influence you had on putting this book together and herding all the cats. And I want to say I am actually about to read the last chapter of the book that you just released.
The Worldview book.
Yeah.
Look, I think, Roger, you have it, don't you, Roger?
Yeah, he made a comment about it being a great book. Well, and the book that you mentioned that was released yesterday, The Manifold Beauty of Genesis 1, when it's talking about some of the numbers, I actually cite Carol's work.
Oh,
so,
well,
yeah.
I mean, it's so simple. You don't have to have supernova explosions or anything to have the old ages. It's just the way they looked at it. And one Sumerian text has one of their kings 28,000 years old, and we think that our view of the patriarchs, they had old ages, but that's the way Egyptians thought of it. The Assyrians, the Sumerians, they had a different worldview of numbers, and that's all there is to it. It's that simple. Anyway, I'm sorry that I need to go.
Carol, we got a request by one of the audience to ask a question.
Oh, okay.
A very quick comment, Carol. I got your book on.
Who's talking?
This is
Raise
me, Robert.
your hand. Who's talking?
This is me, Robert.
Robert. Okay, Robert.
Yeah, I got your book through Logos, the software, and exceedingly well done and well put together and all that. Just a little quick comment. The whole concordance approach that Reasons to Believe provides, and also the more ancient Near Eastern approach that Walton and by Logos and yourself in the worldview context, I'm sort of literally in between. Like I'm sort of wrestling with how to approach the text, and I'll just a little quick comment in that try and look into the Second Temple understandings of Genesis 1 verse 20, because there's a hint of evolution where the early church fathers and the Jews at the time wondered about how birds derive from the oceans. And even Calvin in his commentary actually mentions this, that he doesn't understand the logic and how God could introduce birds out of the oceans, basically he said the fish. And Philip Schaff in the 1800s comments on that and says, oh, look, now Darwin's on the scene. And, he sort of conjectured here's like a hint of that. But yeah, I just wanted to offer that. I reckon the embedding or the embedded nature of the text with respect to modern science, I think
that's the key. My book covers this is science and scripture. Those are the two things. And once you have a worldview approach, then the scripture starts to make sense. Absolutely.
And I love your approach on that. It's really good.
And then all this other stuff that you hear all around, I mean, that's the core. You can just float around the whole thing, but that's the core, I think, to understanding the Bible. And I just covered Genesis, but especially Genesis. You just have to understand where they were coming from. Anyway,
thank you so much, Carol.
Anybody else have a question? And then I'll go here. I wanted to hear Gregg. I wanted to hear about your book because I don't have it yet. But
yeah, Gregg, let's tell us about the new book that just came out yesterday, and for those who pre-ordered, may have arrived even as recent as today.
Yeah, so it's co-authored with Ken Turner, who is an Old Testament and Hebrew scholar from Toccoa Falls College. And the premise of the book, and this was very unique for me because everything I've written before is, of course, in my job is just science. In my outreach, it's been science and faith. And this one the whole book is just theology. And the premise of it was that with most of Scripture, we realize the richness of Scripture, that you can read a passage 6 times and the 7th time you see something new. but then you start talking about Genesis, and all of a sudden that collapses to this sense of there is one understanding to that, and you better get it right. And if you don't understand the whole Bible, and you need to defend that view against all others. And we forget that it too is a rich text, multi-layered. And so we were approaching this not as a like four views of, where each chapter is a standalone view that's competing with the others. We presented actually 7 layers of understanding, where as you approach the text with different questions, you're seeing a different layer of complementary truth. And it's not an all or nothing proposition where you don't have to buy into all 7 in order to for the book to be, for our objectives to be met. If somebody read it and said, I really like 3 or 4 of them, not so sure about the others, that's still a big win, because now because we're hoping that people can begin to shift to talking about their favorite layers and understanding of Genesis, as opposed to defending their layer against other Christians. And that if we get that sense of the theological beauty of this text, that we may also see people start to get less tied up over how does it jive with the science. And you kind of agreeing with what Carol was talking about, that we don't realize the degree to which we have imposed our culture, our worldview on the text, where if you go back to the 16th and 17th centuries, when Western society began to transition through the Enlightenment and elevating the importance of human reasoning and the scientific method, and developing the sense that the highest form of truth is scientific, and we're products of that. And so we find people that in the church thinking unconsciously that, well, if science is the highest form of truth, then Genesis must be a scientific text. And so we're actually imposing that framework on the scriptures instead of allowing the scriptures to speak to us with that understanding, as Carol mentioned, of what was the understanding of the people at the time. John Walton has helped people, or reminded people often, that the Bible was written for us, but not to us. So it was written for everyone at all times, but it was written to a specific people at a specific time, taking advantage of things that they were aware of at the time to enhance their understanding of Scripture. So just taking one example, that now that we know, we've made some of these discoveries about some of these ancient libraries in the ancient Near East, that as people have looked at the treaties of the ancient Hittites, for example, and realized that like the covenants in the Bible actually follow the same pattern as the Hittite treaties. And it's not that they were borrowing the language of the Canaanites or the Hittites. It's that God was making use of common knowledge at the time to demonstrate the truth of the kingdom of God. So they're seeing this covenant and they're like, well, yeah, I get this. I understand this. This follows this treaty pattern from the Hittites, where God is making a treaty, a suzerain vassal treaty, so master to vassal, and also including this land grant of either Eden or then of the promised land. So that was just one layer of the covenant layer. So we also have, just very briefly, there's a polemic layer where it's challenging the beliefs of the surrounding religions. You've got a analogy to the human work week. You've got something we call the song that emphasizes some of the poetic aspects of the story that is often referred to as the framework view. There's a calendar layer where there's a case can be made that the creation story actually encapsulates the agricultural cycle that the Israelites experienced every year. So each of those layers is presented as complementary to all the others.
Well, I think I'm going to leave you all now, unless there's something that they want more to say. And it's so good to see you all again. Gosh, it's been so long since we worked together. So this has been a lot of fun. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Cy, for arranging this, and Ken too. So I'll see you later sometime. Hopefully next summer at the ASA meeting. God willing, right? Who knows? All right, I'm going to leave you now. Thanks.
Thank you, Carol.
Okay, leave meeting.
All right, Barry, you've got a question. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mike. Can you hear me?
Yep.
By the way, I don't have a copy of the. Yeah, I don't have a copy of the book. I thank you for the panel. Thank you especially for Ken's work and Joel's and the others. I wondered if the book alluded to or made direct reference to Darwinian evolution within its pages, first of all. Because I encounter young Earth creation apologists all the time who deliberately conflate OEC with Darwinian evolution. That's as far as our argument is allowed to proceed. They don't hear anything else that we have to say because of their accusation. And that's the strongest objection. I hear it all the time. And it just thwarts our efforts to reach the skeptics, those that are on the fence, students like Robert Rowell in Australia who are really applying his mind to reach truth here. I would that the YEC crowd was honest and objective, but I'll let you answer the question. I'm sorry for rambling a little bit there.
Joel, would you be interested in answering that?
It looked like Gregg was about to say something, and I know what he's going to say. It'll be good.
I was going to say, Joel, would you like to answer that?
I'm all ears, Joel.
Well, I think that in the development of the book, there was a lot of discussion about exactly how we're going to approach the question of evolution. And the decision was, I think I speak for everyone, it was made that we're not going to completely ignore that question in the sense, but that's not at the forefront, and we don't want to turn that particular audience off. This really is about the age of the Earth. That was the central question. Now, there are 2 chapters in there which talk about the succession of organisms throughout the fossils, the fossil record. But in that discussion, it's more of a here's what is there and here's what's present and here's how it doesn't fit with flood geology. Like how would these fossils have gotten sorted out in this way? So it's contrasting the origins of those fossils in an old Earth model of geology with the fossils in the flood geology, without really making any reference to, well, you could imply that order was an order of evolutionary development, but we felt like that we don't need to go there. That's not what this is about. This is about getting young Earth creationists to think about how science works, geology, the age of the Earth as sort of an entry point. And we know that not all Christians agree on the big E word, right? And so there's no reason to really delve into that when there's so many other important basal questions having to do with the age of the Earth.
If I can add to that, Joel. Can I add to that?
Sure.
Well, the other thing that got addressed, though, is the other E word, and that's extinction. And so that's the other half of this story. And that was brought out, just like you mentioned, the abominable mystery. Why is it that all the Paleozoic creatures do not produce pollen? None of them. There isn't a single one of them. That's why there isn't a single piece of pollen to be found in a mile-thick sedimentary stack. And I tried to make the same point pretty hard by pointing out that the so-called corals that you see in the flood geology literature are not our modern corals, and vice versa. And that's where I had my conflicts with Gregg. Gregg can verify this, was over the scientific nomenclature, and Gregg was right. So you know, he's absolutely right. But that's where my goat really gets because they'll throw out the word coral and they won't tell you that, oh, well, the Grand Canyon corals are two orders that are both totally extinct.
Yes.
And our modern corals don't even appear up here until the later Triassic. So, and we provided lots and lots of examples in both of those chapters of things that should have been present if Noah had lived 5,000 years ago and just were never there. They're not there in the Grand Canyon, and we can predict they never will be found in the Grand Canyon.
Yes, we presented enough evidence that the inquisitive mind would have asked those types of questions.
Yeah.
Well, why? Why are these things different?
Right.
And why don't they exist? Why is that pre-flood world not look like the present world really at all?
Yeah.
It's a completely foreign place.
Yeah. And in the process, exposed a lot of bait and switch that goes on in the flood geology literature, where they glibly toss out a generic biological term, and it covers a world of sin, a world of misinformation.
Thank you both. I appreciate that approach.
Well, folks, we're getting we've just run just a little bit over our general meeting time, but I do want to ask one last question of the panelists, and also thank you all for your attendance tonight. This has been fabulous.
Kevin Nelstead is back now. Can we ask him that?
Yes, absolutely should.
What was the question for Kevin? It was something about
homeschooling. Where's Kevin?
He's here now.
Hi, Kevin.
I'll raise my hand if I can find.
You might have.
We can hear you.
You might have left the room.
I did leave the room for like an hour. I've got a stack of firewood that was dumped on my driveway, and I wanted to get it stacked before it rains or snows this weekend. So had to step away.
The question was raised about the possible utility of the Grand Canyon book with homeschool groups, and I basically mentioned that not only are you sort of a marshal of homeschooling data, but you have made a book of your own that you might want to use this as an opportunity for a commercial even.
Okay, hold on just a second.
Please.
By the way, Kevin, we charge for commercials here on Zoom meeting, so I'll send you an invoice when we're done.
No, I've never written a book. No. Here's my book, Earth Science, God's World, Our Home. And it's published by Novari Science and Math, which is started out as a classical science education company. It's been taken over by classical, what's it called?
Classical Academic Press.
Classical Academic Press. Yes, I should know my publisher. But I still think Novari Science and Math. So the book is designed specifically for middle school students, aimed at a 8th grade level, but at a fairly high level, expecting kids in classical schools to be at a reading level and in other areas ahead of their public school peers. So the textbook could be used at, sort of the 9th grade, 10th grade level as well. And so it's the book's been out for about 5 years now, and it is selling pretty well. There's quite a few Christian schools around the country that use it. There's for the past 10 years or so, there have been a lot of people out there saying, homeschoolers or classical school educators who've been saying, hey, we need something different. That, because there are options. And I experienced this when I taught at a classical school in St. Louis, and then I taught overseas for 5.5 years. And, my choice as a teacher for something like earth science was either take a Christian textbook, which would be, like Bob Jones University Press or Abeka, they're just awful on so many levels. Not just age of the earth, but the environment, climate change, all those kind of things. Or use a secular text. And well, the choice was easy. It was a lot easier to undo the bad science or a lot easier to take a secular textbook, and a lot of them are very good, and supplement it with some biblical material about the relationship between science and faith. A lot easier to do that than to take, an Abeka or Bob Jones University Press Young Earth Creationist textbook and undo the bad science and everything else. So that's what this grew out of. It grew out of me being frustrated and hearing that others were frustrated. So that's my book. If I were using this at the high school level, and I want to put some stuff together on this in my spare time, which I don't have, if I were teaching using my textbook at the high school level, I would want to supplement it with some other book. Like here in Montana, I would supplement it with something like Roadside Geology of Montana. Or you could use the Grand Canyon book as a high school supplement, depending on what your objectives as a teacher were. And that would be true whether you're a homeschooler or in a Christian school. So that's my commercial. I hope it's not more of an answer than you wanted.
That's great, Kevin. And I put the link to that book on Amazon in the chat box. So
okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, I just
Kevin runs a website too, just so you know.
I just looked on Amazon. It's like $200.
Don't buy it from Amazon.
Okay.
Buy it direct from the publisher for $70. It's a hardcover, really sturdy book designed for use in classrooms where students use it year after year. So I apologize. $70 is kind of expensive, but don't buy it on Amazon.
Kevin, tell them your website.
Okay. I have a website. It's called GeoChristian, just Geo for geology, geochristian.com. The site's kind of inactive. I just haven't written much in the past year. I've got a dozen articles that are half written. It's just a matter of time. I'm an elder in my church and busy in my job, and but I have hopes of really getting back into it. It's got a fair number of articles on geology and Christian faith.
Thanks, Kevin. And I put your website in the chat box too. So
thank you.
You'll get 3 invoices after we're done.
Okay.
Any last questions before we stop recording and just spend a little time networking? And we've got nothing else. I would like to offer the opportunity to close this out in prayer tonight to anyone out in the audience. Is anyone willing to thank God?
I could. I don't mind.
Hey, Robert, man, that's awesome.
All right. Father, we come before you and praise your name in the blessed Trinity, to give thanks and praise for science that has given us also the opportunity now, especially in these stressful times, to still be able to fellowship, gather a great group of minds through your providential care. And not only that we can uplift each other through this means, but we can also continue to educate future generations of your body, such as this book with respect to the Grand Canyon. And so I just give praise and thanks for everyone in this panel. Definitely has been a huge help in my walk. And I just pray for the upcoming year as well, as this year closes, that your providential care will be on everyone, so that we can keep on giving you the glory and the praise, and keep working through that. Pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Good.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Gregg. Thank you, Ralph, Ken, Roger, Tim, Stephen, and thank you to Wayne and Carol, who had to leave a little bit early. It was an awesome time tonight.